diffusion en direct.
Attends, Catherine,
There we go.
Okay. Welcome everybody to this presentation. Institut Nazareth Louis-Braille and Deafblind Ontario Services, DBOS, announced today the launch of the collaborative partnership on the Community of Practice on Deafblindness. The Community of Practice on Deafblindness was born from an innovative project to support our deafblind program clinicians in 2016. Deafblind Ontario Services joins the COP on Deafblindness on 2018 to collaborate for an English version of the platform. This platform brings together the various actors in deafblindness who share, co-construct knowledge, and interact to maintain and develop rehabilitation expertise. The goals of this first year are focused on promoting the COPD portal by enrolling new members from Ontario and across Canada, and share the resources available with all the researchers, practitioners, and organizations. Interested interveners and other practitioners can visit the website cdp-surdicécité.org for more information on how to enroll to this community of practice on deafblindness. About the Deafblind Ontario Services. Founded in 1989, Deafblind Ontario Services is a not-for-profit organization that helps individuals who are deafblind to increase their independence and improve their quality of life through specialized services. With residential location and community service programs across the province, services extend into a wide range of communities in Ontario. About ENLB. Founded in 1861, ENLB provides services to people with visual impairments. We contribute greatly to the development of knowledge and the improvement of clinical practice through its involvement in the four facets of its university missions. It trains professionals specialized in visual rehabilitation, optometry, and other disciplines. It also develops tools for information monitoring and technology evaluation. Its programs and services are aimed at individuals of all ages. About the deafblindness program of ENLB and ERD. The deafblindness program is a joint program of the Nazareth Institute and Louis-Braille and the Raymond Dewar Institute. It was set up in 2005 to meet the rehabilitation needs of a growing clientele with specific needs. Madame Sylvie Bilodeau, now director of the DITSA and the DP programs for the CIS Montérégie Centre, she was the first manager of deafblindness program. Today we thank her warmly for actively supporting the deafblind community of practice. L'Institut Nazareth et Louis-Braille du CIS à Montérégie Centre et Deafblind Ontario Services annonce le lancement de la version bilingue de la plateforme de la communauté de pratique en surdicécité que vous trouverez sur le site web cdp-surdicécité.org. La communauté de pratique en surdicécité est née en 2016 d'un projet innovant de INLB pour soutenir d'abord le développement professionnel des intervenants du programme surdicécité, qui est un programme conjoint de l'Institut Nazareth et Louis-Braille et de l'Institut Raymond Dewar. Aujourd'hui, la CDP rassemble une centaine de membres, acteurs en surdicécité qui partagent et co-construisent des connaissances, des pratiques et interagissent pour maintenir et développer une expertise en réadaptation. Maintenant, en devenant bilingue, la plateforme permettra à un plus grand nombre d'intervenants, de chercheurs et d'enseignants de partager cette expertise. Nous souhaitons donc la bienvenue à tous les nouveaux membres. Welcome to all the new members. Je remercie les acteurs de ce projet, Mme Sylvie Bilodeau, Catherine Tequier, Francine Barry, Chad Gagnon de Eclowell, and for DBOS, Mrs. Karen Case, Rainy Minhas, Josie Queen, ainsi que Michelle James. Je remercie aussi tous les collaborateurs, dont Sylvie Auclair, Lynn Brissette, Michael Sweeney et tous ceux qui ont contribué de près de loin à la réussite de ce projet. Mais je remercie particulièrement M. Walter Wittich, qui est à l'origine de ce projet, qui nous a permis de rencontrer l'organisation de DBOS. M. Walter Wittich est un chercheur reconnu dans le domaine de la surdicécité. professeur adjoint à l'École d'optométrie de l'Université de Montréal, chercheur en résidence du Centre de recherche Le CRIR, Institut Nazareth et Louis-Braille, président réseau de la recherche de Deafblind International, directeur adjoint Axe déficience visuelle et réadaptation du réseau de recherche en santé de la vision. Alors, je remercie M. Walter d'être là aujourd'hui pour nous présenter une conférence qui a pour titre Assistive Technology, The Holy Grail of Dual Sensory Impairment Rehabilitation, or is it, en l'honneur pour souligner la journée internationale de la surdicécité. M. Walter.
Thank you, Bernadette. Thank you very, very much for introducing me and also for inviting me to speak today. I will speak in English. If there are questions later on, we can always switch languages if necessary, but we'll go in English for now. I'm very excited to give this presentation today. Some of these pieces may already be information that people have seen before, but I think it's always a good idea to remind ourselves once in a while of what is we're doing, what context we're working in. And so hang in there, you'll see where I'm going with this. Now, my presentation is specifically about the context of assistive devices in rehabilitation for dual sensory impairment. I quite like my slide here at the beginning. For those of you who have seen the Indiana Jones movies, there's one of those that actually contains a holy grail. It turns out it also comes with its own cup holder, so you can have a device for a device. I thought it was a nice, cute little start for our adventure today. I always start out by thanking and disclosing the people that choose to give us money to do the things that we do, but I'm actually not in conflict of interest with any of the devices that I'm speaking about today. I've already been introduced in a very comprehensive way, so I just want to give you a mini overview of all the places that are part of this network that I'm working in, being based at the University of Montreal with having rehab research laboratories, satellite labs in the rehab centers, and then my university affiliations also with McGill, where I play a little bit in the world of activities of daily living with the occupational therapists, and in psychology with quality of life with the psychologists, and then overall hanging it all together with the work that we do at Deafblind International. So you can see that I like to have a finger in every pie possible. What I want to do, because most of my work focuses on aging and acquired sensory loss, I'll stick with what I know mostly, and I will talk a little bit about aging and sensory aging specifically, and then switch over to the world of assistive devices. Many of you will have seen or heard about this graph before, the population pyramid of Canada in the 1970s versus, in this case, in 2010, and how you can see how this bulge of the population of baby boomers is slowly aging, and how that is determining many things from rehab service delivery to many other policy questions and funding allocations. There's a different way of looking at that same graph in a different way, whereby we look at the proportion of the population under 65 versus over the age of 14. And so in 2015, actually, something interesting happened where a switch happened. And now suddenly the proportion of the population that is over 65 is larger than the population under 14. And it will affect for the coming decades of how business is done, how health care is provided, because often the priorities will follow the numbers. There's another interesting way of looking at the same numbers, and these are the projections of how many people in Canada are actually over the age of 100. These are the centenarians. Right now, we're estimating there are roughly 8,000 of them, but this number is likely going to multiply by a factor of 10 by the year 2060. Depending on how it goes, I may be part of this image. We'll see. Depends on a lot of different things. But the reason I bring this up today is because a lot of the questions about acquired vision and hearing loss are, of course, linked to extreme age and very fragile age. And so when we look at the centenarians, the probability of having an acquired dual sensory loss becomes very high. But as a reminder, just for context, it turns out most older people actually see and hear relatively well. There are, of course, problems associated simply with aging that are not problems of disease necessarily, but in general, most people do quite well. What is difficult for us in the world of rehabilitation as well as the world of research now is what's actually normal. What do we consider normal vision and normal hearing for somebody who is 104? And then do we need to intervene? Is this person actually experiencing some impairment? So this is a very multifaceted picture. In a second, when we look at hearing loss specifically, just about normal changes with aging and with hearing, something that I've always found interesting is that age-related hearing loss or presbycusis is generally symmetrical. It's generally bilateral. And so when the hearing loss is uneven, especially as you go into older age, it may be an interesting indicator for things that may otherwise be undetected. So this asymmetry may itself be a very interesting facet. But there is large variability in how presbycusis affects older people. For some, the onset is quite early. For some, this may be quite late. Some people progress rather quickly. Others do so more slowly. And it is, of course, partially part of the normal aging context. There are some genetic components that influence this. There can be medication side effects that are involved, but one of the main driving pieces is noise. And so it's also interesting how there are different generational effects in noise exposure. If you look at some of the older generation now, this noise exposure may have been in the context of work. If you look at some of the younger generations, it is predicted that some of this noise exposure is actually linked to in-the-ear earphones. So we'll see how that develops over time as well. What is clear and what everybody agrees on is that the prevalence of age-related hearing loss, of course, increases with age. And so you can roughly estimate that 1 in 3 individuals at the age of 65 have some level of functional hearing loss, whereas that is 1 in 2 once we get over 75. And this number only increases as we grow into the higher age ranges. And specifically, we're looking at losses in the higher frequencies. The solution, of course, is making things audible. And so if you live within the world of audiograms, you'd like to move things from this audible range that is higher up on the audiogram down now between those 2 red lines on my slides where things can become audible. But what is very interesting, by amplifying sound this way, you have to be careful that you don't amplify too much, because you may move it right out of the audible range and thereby actually cause damage, cause pain to the auditory system as well. So it becomes a little bit of a Goldilocks idea of how much you want to apply, but not too much. Similarly, some of us have already experienced some of the normal changes of vision. One of my favorite is how the near point changes by simply getting older and having your lens become older and less flexible. Many of us start reading by holding things slightly further away, and then there is that critical point when your arm becomes too short and you have to switch to reading glasses. And so this near point change reaches arm's length roughly in our mid-40s. And so for all of you who are listening and watching, it's completely normal to wear glasses at this point, not to worry. Another change that is completely normal with the aging visual system is the need for more lighting, for more luminance. And so you can actually say that retinal illuminance itself needs to be, can only be equivalent in a younger and an older person if you have about 11 times as much light for somebody who is 60 years old to have the same experience of brightness. I find that in itself a fascinating normal process, because we would not necessarily consider that this wouldn't be linked to a disease process, but this is completely normal. Part of this is because less light enters the eye because of something called pupillary meiosis. The pupil doesn't open quite as wide anymore as it used to, and so less light comes in because the muscle is weaker. I wanted to take a moment and talk about the importance of the context of the visual system, because this here is an interesting and important study by Enoch that was done in the 1990s, where we looked at people that have a completely normal, healthy visual system and compared people across different ages. So what you have on the x-axis are participants across old age all the way into the high 90s. What you do at the y-axis is you have the denominator of the Snellen fraction, so 20/20, meaning you can see at 20 feet what somebody with normal vision can see at 20 feet. If it becomes 2200, you can see at 20 feet what a normally sighted person can see all the way away from 200 feet. So as this denominator gets larger, your vision gets poorer. And so you can see for this very top line that across all old ages, so to speak, looking at a black and white acuity chart under good lighting, age doesn't really have that much of an effect on that kind of ability. So perfect conditions of black on white, age does not really matter that much. For the next line below, we're only making one tiny change. Instead now, the letters are gray and not black. So we've reduced contrast. And it turns out that especially for the higher age group, acuity drops down right away if they don't have full contrast anymore. If you now look at the next line, I have also dimmed the light. So now the viewing conditions are not perfect anymore because you have less light in the room and it's low contrast. Things become difficult, and you can see how our over 85 group now is actually approaching a level that we would call legally blind. And our final line here is now I've added glare, and suddenly vision becomes much more difficult in this task for the older gang. Keep in mind, these are all the same people and they're all healthy. The only thing we've changed are the conditions under which they view this acuity chart. Now, of course, there's this ongoing problem. We do measurements. We have to have measurements for policy decisions, for categorizations, for the allocations of assistive devices. We need to have some threshold whether people are or are not considered impaired. And so many times we fall onto the acuity measure or the audiogram. And not all of us are a fan of this type of measurement. Of course, there are many other things we can do. Contrast sensitivity might be an interesting measure that may relate more to the ability of visual function in everyday life, similar with the measurement of signal to noise ratio in hearing and the ability to perceive speech. And I do want to acknowledge that sometimes things do go wrong. People do develop age-related impairments. I wanted to quickly touch on the big four in vision, which are cataract. Cataract's an interesting one because in our context in Canada, this is treatable and this treatment is relatively widely available. So I don't really call it a cause of visual impairment in Canada, but globally it surely is. Glaucoma, of course, a reduction in the peripheral field, functionally. Diabetic retinopathy, we often call it Swiss cheese vision because you may have sections of the retina that are well and others that are not, and you kind of see in between. And then finally, of course, macular degeneration, which affects the central visual field. And then we have a cast of thousands beyond those most popular ones that may cause all sorts of things in the visual system. Now, heading into our specialty of dual sensory loss today, I want to just throw out some vocabulary so we all are on the same same page. My favorite phrase remains combined vision and hearing loss. It is likely the least threatening of all the terms that we use, specifically when we talk to our clients. People talk about dual sensory impairment, people talk about acquired deaf blindness. And so depending on who you are and what your context is, you may or may not be comfortable with all of these. In service delivery in general, people are quite comfortable using deaf blindness as your umbrella term. Mind you, when you talk to researchers, people like me then go, well, these people are neither deaf nor blind the way I really understand it. Many of the clients will refuse going to services that are for people that are deaf and blind because they don't identify that way. So we have a bit of work to do when it comes to definitions. But I find it, my favorite definition is likely from the American Association for the Deafblind because it includes functional aspects of communication, of information access, of the ability to participate, work, get an education, be independent. And the other definition that I always try to add in is the Nordic definition because it really builds the foundation that deafblindness is a distinct and unique ability. It's not just adding a vision loss to a hearing loss. There is something new that is created by the inability of compensating for one loss with the other sense. Now, in Canada, of course, we're not really all that different from many other places. And so there are some interesting studies that look at the prevalence of how big our problem actually is. This interesting study pooled data across 11 European countries, and it basically points out that once we look at the population of the age of 50 and up, 1 in 3 people have some kind of sensory issue. That may be vision only or hearing only or both, but that basically means that if you meet a person over the age of 50, there's a 1 in 3 chance that they may not hear or see everything that is going on. And specifically in service delivery in the healthcare system, this is not necessarily a piece of information that I believe has truly sunk in. It's also that it really matters whether or not you have a dual loss, because I just came back from Reykjavik 2 weeks ago, and I was talking to the researchers there specifically about their AGES study, which showed very clearly that if you have a dual sensory loss, your risk for mortality goes up. And so this being, a rather severe side effect. Now, I want to take you on a mini journey with a graph that I've been playing with. This is some new data that we're trying to present. And so what I'm doing here is I've been looking at various pieces of prevalence of dual sensory loss, specifically for people over the age of 50. And so what we ended up doing is we found a couple of studies where dual sensory loss is categorized and measured in an objective way. So we're looking at our classic measures of visual acuity and the audiogram, the pure tone averages. And then we plotted the age of the people in the sample on the x-axis and the prevalence of dual sensory loss in the study on the y-axis. Now you will see that I have a little bit of a line here that sort of indicates as age goes up, prevalence goes up, but you will see that my bubbles are different size. And so these little bubbles here represent in size how many people were in the study. So the larger the bubble, the larger the sample in the study. So population-based studies would be very large, and experimental studies with only a couple of 20, 30 people would be much smaller. What is fascinating, though, is that when you plot this all into one graph, how many of them do overlap? So even though they are different countries, relatively different populations, even the indication of prevalence going up over time emerges out of putting this all together. You will see, of course, here's one study where the prevalence is a lot higher, and the population itself is much older. And this is actually a study that is done in the context of a retirement home, long-term care. So it's not surprising that a study like this, the proportion would be much higher. Now we have a study graph like this also for subjective measures. The difference here is now we don't know what acuities and hearing loss might be according to the audiogram, but participants tell us themselves, I have trouble with my hearing, I have trouble with my vision, or I have trouble with both in this case. Again, you can see that some of these bubbles are very, very large because these are very large population-based studies. And so we have access to more data simply because you don't need to administer an acuity and an audiogram to everybody. But you will also see that the variability is rather large because, of course, now you rely on what people tell you. You will also see that there's one study that is really far out over here. It's quite different. It's also that it turns out this population was the youngest, even though it includes people over the age of 50, which is why it is here, but most of them were younger. And this is actually a study that was conducted with the veterans in the US. So it turns out that for them, the prevalence is relatively high, but also the cause is very different because a lot of these causes of sensory loss are trauma related in terms of warfare. Some of you have probably seen this study because it deals with the data set in Ontario. This is Don Guthrie's team looking at the prevalence of vision, hearing, and cognitive impairment for people that are living in, I believe it is home care. And so it's a fascinating data set because in Ontario you have the mandated administration of the inter-RAI measure, which is where these data come from. And I found it very fascinating to see how large the proportions are of people that have more than one problem. Because the proportion of people that only have a vision loss around 5, or only have a hearing impairment around 11, or only have a cognitive problem about 23%, but the rest of the data set are multiple impairments, putting aside actually that there are also about 60,000 people, or 20% of the total sample, that have no sensory or cognitive impairment. They're mentioned but not graphed here. Thought it was an interesting piece to see, simply because it reminds us that the context of our service delivery cannot just focus on one piece at a time. The large proportion of the sample require help on multiple fronts at the same time, and it will influence how we provide our services, since we need to consider these other impairments while we provide the services we provide. Many of you have been waiting for this slide for a long time, and we are about to submit this for publication. I'm very excited. This is the first calculation of the prevalence of dual sensory impairment as we see it in the Canadian longitudinal study on aging. So this graph is based on the very first data wave that was released last year. Interesting stories, of course, not surprising at all that prevalence goes dramatically up after the age of 70, but also very interesting that this increase is a lot steeper for men than it is for women. This is done in proportion to the sample. I find that interesting because when we look at the service delivery, we often serve more women than we do men. And so there is likely still an underserved population in there somewhere that we still need to find. I will say that our definition of dual sensory loss in this context is rather liberal, because the population itself, in order to participate in the study, is extremely healthy. But this article is soon to come, so you will be able to read much in this in detail. When you look at this, like I said, when you look at the distribution of people that are in dual sensory rehabilitation, the ones that I'm plotting here above my red line are actually the same people that you would have seen before in the bubble plot. These are the people over the age of 50. But I want to just point out that the large majority of this group in the sensory rehab are over the age of 80. And that are the parents of the baby boomers. I've said this many times before, but I still think this warrants hearing again and again. The real wave of our clients has not appeared yet, because the baby boomers are not really in this graph yet. It is their parents only that we're dealing with. So we need to think about this specifically in the way we structure and allocate resources for years to come, because our programs will be busy. Now, in this busyness of rehabilitating these people, one key piece, of course, is going to be assistive technology. And I think that we need to reflect a little bit about how we approach the idea of assistive technology in dual sensory rehab, because the expectations are high. I call it the Holy Grail in my title. And so the vision people, optometry, ophthalmology, all the eye care professionals have high expectation on their devices. That holds as well for the medical professions and the audiology professions in hearing. And then you've got, of course, in Ontario, the interveners. These professions have different names in different places. There's the spouse. The spouse definitely has an expectation of making the life of the spouse better, but also the life of the care provider in order to alleviate some of the pressures. And then you've got formal care providers that play in there, and now I'm going to put all the other people in there that actually may have something to gain, whether that is because they make the devices or because they make decisions about the devices, or they have to reimburse the devices. So there's, of course, the side of money in there as well. And last but not least, the client themselves may have big expectations about what such a device can do for them. And so everybody is staring at this device going, can you do what we want you to do? So I want to spend the rest of the time looking at assistive devices from two different directions. And that is devices that are made for a hearing impairment and devices that are made for vision impairment, and how they are usable or used when both impairments are present. So the first study that we conducted in this context looked at the usability of assistive listening devices. So for those who are not familiar, assistive listening devices are basically technologies for hearing loss, anything other than a hearing aid. So these are things that don't go in the ear. This would be a vibrating alarm clock, for example, or other devices that are built for hearing loss, but that are not a hearing aid. My definition of assistive technology is very, very open-minded. I've done panel discussions and client discussions where I've gone as far as considering a guide dog an assistive device. There are situations where the clients consider their own spouse an assistive device because that is who/what facilitates what they need to be doing. And so they may heavily rely on their spouse in certain activities. I'm not going to go there too far today, but I think that we need to have a very open mind when it comes to that assistive technology component. We're sticking today to the definition of the World Health Organization, which is really about devices and systems and technology. Now, I want to throw out just a few examples. This slide could be an entire talk in itself. We know that not everybody is really that excited about using an assistive device. For example, 1 in 4 people that are eligible for a hearing aid actually do so. There's a lot of stigma attached to hearing loss, to hearing aids specifically. People want to hide them. Of course, they are made to be hidden often. They're designed that way. And if you look at hearing assistive technology, only about 1 in 7 people that could benefit from them actually have some. It could also be that they're not aware, but they're not very distributed. When you look at vision, the story is not that much different. 1 in 4 devices are generally abandoned. It's been my experience as a low vision therapist when you do a home visit, how often things are stored in some forgotten kitchen drawer, or that the device is still in the same pristine box that it was in when I delivered it 3 months ago. So these devices are not often used, and when they are used, roughly 1 in 4 users are unhappy about what the device can do for them. So the expectations are not fulfilled, which then often lead to abandonment of the device itself. We have no information about device abandonment in dual sensory loss at this point. If there is, please let me know. I haven't found anything. If you're out there and you're looking to do a master's or a PhD about device abandonment and dual sensory loss, come find me. So the next step, of course, is that when these devices are built and designed and produced, they are primarily made to deal with that impairment. So a vision device is made to be used by somebody with a vision impairment, but we don't necessarily consider the hearing loss in the design of a vision device. But it may very well interfere, maybe the other way around. How to assemble something like a pocket talker if you can't see all the pieces. So it becomes a barrier, a different type of barrier to the use of the device itself. I have an image here of somebody trying to set the time on a vibrating alarm clock, where at the bottom of the screen you've got the vibrating piece that goes under the pillow. Somebody decided in the design that they were very intelligent to give it large numbers, but it turns out over here on the very left in very small print is the information you need to know if you want to actually set the alarm, or God help you if you want to change daylight savings time. So suddenly the obvious piece of functioning may work, but the actual use of it becomes a challenge again. So when we look at device usability, there are a couple of interesting things we need to consider. The first one, of course, in the context of vision, is the visibility and legibility of the information. Hand-eye coordination, dexterity play into this in the context of aging or in the context of neuropathy and diabetes. Definitely important to consider. There may be motor complexity that needs to be had in order to be able to do what we need to do with the device, and cognitively, the user needs to be able to actually have enough resources to deal with the device. So I want to go through those in a little bit more detail. These are some of my favorite examples about visibility and legibility. The people in device development for diabetes have done a wonderful job already in making devices more adapted to the fact that people need to visually interact with these devices. You can see how glare can easily become a problem if the surface is reflective. Contrast may be a problem if the screen and the display are not really that different. This here, I believe, is probably the best level of contrast in terms of this device, but it can go wrong rather quickly. Now, then I thought, well, you know, here I am on Google finding images about things. I find myself in a conference in Bethesda with a blow dryer in the hotel where I can't find the on button. It took a while. And of course, it's black on black and has black writing. And so there it was. And I was thinking, well, I'm in the States, you know, these Americans, they don't know how to do this. And so a conference later, I was in Toronto, and now we just had the whole thing in reverse, and everything was white on white. Again, if somebody requires high contrast information to operate this blow dryer, they are absolutely out of luck. So these problems exist everywhere. Dexterity is an interesting topic as well, and there has been quite a bit of interesting research about hand-eye coordination in the presence of visual impairment. Here is a study that looks at people with glaucoma that are reaching and grasping an item, and so it turns out that the hand comes out of a region of the visual field that is not visible to the person and only becomes visible when it enters the central field. And that will affect the speed, the width of the hand, and the overall way of how this movement is completed. This is similar in macular degeneration, where now the problem is reversed. You can see the hand as it starts, but then the hand disappears once it approaches the area where the scotoma of the macula functioning lies. And so people slow down, people overextend their hands and their fingers in order to make sure that they can reach and grab whatever they're trying to find in order not to miss it. So again, the whole action of hand-eye coordination is changed and affected by this process. If we look at motor complexity, in the beginning, I wasn't quite sure what we would consider complex, but there is actually a bit of research out there that the simple act of double clicking on a mouse or on a mouse pad may already be considered a complex motor activity for an older adult. So even though it may appear simple, we need to figure out what is an age-appropriate, simple versus difficult task. What ends up happening is the moment complexity interferes, the motion becomes slower, people make more errors, and of course, in the interaction with an electronic device or any kind of assistive device, the moment you become slower or you make errors, then it doesn't actually do anymore what you want it to do. When we come to cognitive complexity, there's something called production rules. This comes from the world of design and ergonomics. And here we're actually looking at knowing the steps that you need to know in order to be able to do a task. An example I often use is if you have a smartphone and you need to go to airplane mode, in the latest version of software on the iPhone, for example, you just swipe up and you will have a new menu where you can now select airplane mode. Few versions back, this was 5 or 6 different steps in order to get there through the general menu of interfacing with the telephone. So the complexity of the production rules has been reduced and it's easier to do. This means there are less cognitive resources required, and that will allow easier access to using the device. So the requirements have to be less than the cognitive resources necessary. So the questions that we asked in the context of our study was, can people with a visual impairment actually use those hearing devices? What kind of characteristics that they may have may predict if they can use these devices? And can we help them get better by repetition of the task or giving them strategies and instruction? So we ended up working with a group of people from the MAB Mackay Rehabilitation Center who were visually impaired only. We also had a group of dual sensory impaired clients, and we had a control group that was sensory impaired that I will come back to in a moment. We measured their cognition. We also measured their dexterity, and we did a little interview with them. I will leave the interview component out for today, but it's very interesting how well and self-aware they are about the problems that they are having. And then we asked them to do naturalistic tasks. The first one was to assemble a pocket talker. So you literally have to plug in the microphone, you plug in the headset, and then set the volume button on 3, which was somewhere in the middle. The second thing we asked them to do is use an adapted telephone. Pick up the phone, dial your own telephone number, find the amplification button and press it, and then hang up the phone. And we timed them to see how long it would take them. I have an image here of the quick guide of our adapted telephone, and so this explains what I call the Walter condition in my study. If you are anything like me, you get a new device, first thing you do is you take it out of the box and then you turn it on and you try it out. And it is only if it is not working that you will actually consider reading the instructions. So here the instructions themselves are already rather complicated and not necessarily readable for somebody with a visual impairment. So we decided we have 2 conditions. One is the out of the box. We just ask you to do it without any instructions or guidance. And the second one is that we will actually show you how it's done, and then we let you do it yourself. Our groups were relatively comparable, which is always important in the context of research, so we know that it was not some other factor that made this happen. And what was also interesting is that whether people failed or passed the Montreal Cognitive Assessment didn't matter between our groups, so we decided just to look at everybody else because our tasks were simple enough that everybody in the study was able to do our protocol. So here we're looking at the success rate of people being able to assemble the pocket talker. If you look at the very right, this is our control group. They all got this done. We actually had one person make a mistake the second time around because they didn't get the volume right, so we said, all right, well, that's a mistake. On the very left, we have the people that only have low vision, and so it turns out having them just do it in the Walter condition, only about 25% could do it, but them showing them brought that up to 50%. All right, that's not bad, you know. If we look at the people with dual sensory loss, it more or less looked the same. And my little control group, the sensory control group, had the same pattern. Like I said, I will come back to them in a little moment. But what is remarkable here is that none of the impaired groups came up to 100%. And so to me, that is sort of an indicator that there may be some people where we can do sort of a quick and dirty mini intervention. But for the people that cannot take that step, we may then need to go to a more complicated level of actual rehabilitation with an intervener that knows what they're doing and they dedicate a little bit more time. So it might be an interesting way of allocating resources this way. If we do the same stuff with the telephone, we actually get the same pattern overall. The big difference is that the numbers are overall higher, and that is because the telephone as a device is much more known and familiar. So people can do this better. Again, we don't reach 100% everywhere, but it's much better overall. We tried to do a complicated logistic analysis to see whether or not we could predict what kind of client variables might identify the ones that can do it versus the ones that don't. The sample was too small to come to a really strong conclusion, but the one thing we did find is that if we would use any one of those variables as a predictor, it didn't really tell us that much. But the moment the client profile was more complicated, the acuity was poorer, they were older, and their hearing was more severely impaired, or they failed the MoCA on top of all of this, the moment 2 or 3 of these factors came together, the probability of them not being able to do this shot through the roof. So basically, it is complexity and comorbidity that we propose is going to here. We also looked at how long it took them to actually do our task. And so it turned out, our control group did relatively well, took them less than 20 seconds, and doing it again took them even less because they had practice. Both our vision and our dual sensory group took longer, makes some sense, and all of them got faster doing it a second time. Great, that means there's an effect of practice. But I don't know now whether this is practice or whether it is actually us having them shown it. So it may be that this is actually the effect of the rehab intervention. And that is where my repeat control group comes in. We had this third group that got the intervention right away. So we didn't just let them struggle through the Walter condition. We let them do this right away with proper instruction like you would in rehab. And it turns out they then started better right away. But then we just asked them to do it again. And so now all we have is practice. And it turns out the effect of instruction is there, but then with practice, they get even faster. And they're now almost at the same level as our control group. So we get a separate effect of the instruction and strategy and of just trying it a couple of times to get it done. With the telephone, we had the same effect, only the effect was smaller, again, because we think the telephone is more familiar. Now, coming back, it was interesting that our success rate ranged anywhere from 20 to 90%, but it really depended on what kind of task it was, how complicated it was, and if people were familiar with the device. The factors alone didn't really tell us who would fail, but the combination thereof might be the secret. And then, of course, giving people a brief explanation already has a benefit. I would say it's the level of information that we would give or that we would expect from the person in the store where you bought the device, or maybe your family member who bought the device for you. It's that level of simplicity. Practice improves things, but it doesn't do that for everybody and not under all circumstances. So really, my advice here is find the complicated cases because they really need your help. And then we decided to just turn this upside down because now we looked at the visibility of hearing devices, but what about the audibility of vision devices, specifically devices that speak to you? Because now suddenly your interaction depends on your sense of hearing, even though you're trying to compensate for your sense of vision. This was a student project in my lab that started 2 years ago, and I have some brand new data for you that have only been presented briefly once last week. Now, in the terms of audibility, we talked earlier about amplifying things so they get into that range of where you can hear them. And so that is, of course, always that game. How do you find something that is audible, but it's not going to be damaging to you or painful? So finding that range, in this case, this is called the design window, is the level of audibility, the level of volume, where you can optimally hear whatever is being spoken to you. The devices that we started out with is we looked at a digital watch and a digital calculator that both have a chip in there with a microphone, and so they can speak to you. They will tell you the time. They will tell you the numbers of what you're calculating. We also later on included a scanner that will actually read text to you from a standardized page. And so we were curious, what happens if you use these devices, but you now have a dual sensory loss? The options for these devices are really limited. Of course, one of my favorite ones that I saw a while ago was a bathroom scale that talks to you. I'm not always entirely convinced that I want my bathroom scale to talk to me, but I also thought this would be interesting for assessment, whether it matters how tall you are, because it depends on how far you are away from your scale. So, of course, there are devices like this, but there are many, many other implications. Books on tape, of course, screen reading software for people that are blind, and then this new world of Siri and Google Home and Alexa and all sorts of other devices in your world that may talk to you. We know very little about how well these things are usable in the context of dual sensory loss. And then, of course, there are various challenges. Yes, you can adjust the volume, not always as widely over a range as you would like. You can be near and far to this device. You may listen to this device in your first or second or third language. That will affect audibility. This is synthesized speech, so it's not the same as real spoken speech. You may be able to control the speed at which the speed comes on. You may have partial hearing. It becomes very complicated very quickly. You can see how this would be difficult. And of course, if I come back to the idea of the audiogram, there may only be a part of the spectrum of the sound that is important for you, but that you have lost because of your age-related hearing loss. So some information gets through, others doesn't, and you have to somehow reconstruct this. So what we decided to do is we asked whether older adults with a vision loss that do or don't have a hearing loss as well are able to use these type of devices that have a speech output. And then we asked simple questions. Can they do it? Looking at their success. How accurate are they when they use them? And finally, what is their sense of confidence that they got it right with the device? Again, we had two different groups of people with vision loss and people with dual sensory loss, and we gave them different conditions. There was different conditions in terms of the volume of the device. The lowest volume was what the device was designed to be at when you would use it roughly at 10 inches distance. The second volume that we used is that volume 10 decibel louder. And then the third volume, which is another 10 decibel louder, but for some of these devices, that was actually outside of the functional range of what the device can produce. We just decided to amplify the sound artificially more in order to see whether this range of the devices should be larger. We did this also at 2 levels of repetition because we were thinking, if you have a watch, you don't hear it the first time, you can press that button again. So we gave them one condition with 1 repetition and one condition with 4 repetitions, just to see if they would just need to hear it a couple of times. So here's what happened, and hold on to your seat. We're looking at the success rate, meaning this is the proportion of people in our sample that were able to do our task without mistake. If we look at the general effect of volume. The proportion of people able to do it went up in general as the volume went up. If you look at the effect of repetition, in general, people got more right when they had it repeated more often. Not always, but in general. And then there's that important piece of context. The proportion of people getting a sentence right on a scanner where the sentence came out of context was very, very low. This is one of the most difficult tasks in here. Whereas this proportion for things like watch, you know the watch is telling you the time, so you already know what you're listening for. You know the calculator will give you numbers, but you don't know what the scanner is going to do. And it's a short sentence out of context, could be anything. When we look at the accuracy, it turns out, you crank up the volume, people become more accurate. Also turns out that if you repeat it more times, accuracy increases as well. But it turns out you can see already that the overall accuracy for people with dual sensory loss was a lot lower. It never went past 60%. And I'm not sure as a rehab professional whether 60% of the time would be sufficient for me to consider this a successful intervention. If we look at the confidence now, something really interesting happens. Of course, people's confidence goes up if the volume goes up, because also their accuracy goes up. So those two are correlated with each other. It turns out that the benefit that people get from the repetition is actually not that big. So there's a little bit of this, well, if I don't hear it well the first time, I'm not so sure if I will have heard it better the fourth time. Confidence doesn't really increase that much this way. And overall, for our dual sensory group, confidence stayed in the lower half of our scale. So they're not confident at all that they really can do what they need to do with these devices. Now, of course, the next steps is I'm always interested in testing more people and larger samples. I can do more exciting things statistically as well. I want to get into some of the more modern technologies, such as these home devices that will tell you what the weather is and who called and all of that. That's going to be very interesting. I'm also further investigating this idea of the mini intervention, meaning that you have somebody who does this initial triage to solve all the simple problems, so you don't waste valuable time of a highly trained clinician of any kind, but this may be doable by somebody who has less training, an assistant of type. And then, of course, there's another big problem with devices. There is always the question whether our clients actually want to use these devices. And that's not always the case. We're launching a few more studies in our world that have to do with stigmatization, where we're trying to understand the reasoning behind why somebody will use a device and not another, or why they used it first and then abandoned it. This is something that is very, very interesting to me. So that is sort of my world of assistive devices and dual sensory loss. There's a long list of people that I want to thank for the work that we've done here. But for those of you who want to know more, I invite all of you to go on Twitter and find us. I am at Walter Wittich, and we also have a Twitter account for the Canadian Consortium on Neurodegeneration and Aging, whereby Team 17 specifically focuses on vision loss, hearing loss, and cognitive impairment. Thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with us today. I don't know whether we have a sign-off or whether we have a question period or...